What I always say is, in my dream world, international aid feels more like mutual aid. Why is it easier for us emotionally, or just even in terms of operationally, to give to our neighbors GoFundMe down the street than it is to give to somebody in a place like Myanmar that's experiencing extreme hardship?
Many of us got into crypto because we believed that this ecosystem could rewrite the rules of finance globally. In America, in the EU, in much of Asia, the financial infrastructure is pretty good. But there are so many places around the world where this stuff is not. According to the World Bank, there are still about 1.4 billion people around the world that don't have access to a formal financial account at a bank or even a mobile money provider. It is very hard for them to even get money out. So when you think of the $220 billion a year that's sent around the globe to help in aid projects, there's a giant opportunity for us to disrupt what is a very inefficient system. The amount of fees, the last mile disbursement costs, exchange rates, the sort of currency fluctuations that happen in a lot of these countries. The category is ripe for someone to come in and figure out, how do we finally get money to the farthest reaching locations on the planet for those most in need? My next guest, Melyn McKay, she's one of the people trying to figure out this problem. She has a long history in the aid world. She's worked at some of the sort of foremost institutions around this category. But she, along with her company Koala Pay, are really trying to reimagine this world and think about, how do we get aid money across the globe in seconds, extremely cheap, and how do we really rewrite the rules of how aid is distributed around the planet? So after the break, listen to my conversation with Melyn McKay as she tells us how we can reimagine how to help those most in need with the billions of dollars that are wasted all around the globe in trying to just get money out to the world. Stay tuned.
Wish you could access cash without selling your Bitcoin? Lenin makes that possible. The global leader in Bitcoin-backed lending, Lenin has issued over $9 billion in loans since 2018 and never lost a single Satoshi of client assets. Why is a Lenin loan different? With custodied loans, collateral is not lent out to generate interest, no credit checks, funds in less than 12 hours, no monthly payments, repay whenever you want with zero penalties. And proof of reserves reports verified by a top accounting firm are published every 6 months. Lenin gives Bitcoin holders a secure, transparent way to unlock liquidity without selling. Learn more at ledn.io. That's LEDN.io.
All right, we are here with Dr. Melyn McKay. Melyn is an amazing entrepreneur that we met over the last bunch of months, was also with us at Consensus. And what I really love about the work that Melyn and Koala Pay are doing is this real world use case of how we can utilize blockchain rails to better satisfy the needs of those, especially in the impact and aid world. And there are few people as talented to talk about this as Melyn. So first of all, Melyn, thank you for coming to Gen C.
Thanks so much for having me, Sam.
I guess I would love first to start. I know you've been the founder and sort of leading Koala Pay for the last almost 3 years, but I was interested in maybe just hearing about what got you into this segment of work and why it continues to inspire you.
Sure. I think I have a somewhat unusual experience coming into the blockchain space. My background's in anthropology. I'd been working in the humanitarian aid sector for coming on 15 years and had no intention, no interest, no desire to do anything related to, I mean, frankly speaking, technology, let alone blockchain specifically. And had throughout the course of my career pretty consistently run up against challenges with money movement when you're working in a place like Juba. I used to run an office in Juba, which at the time didn't have a functioning ATM, barely had, I think, 40 kilometers of paved road. If your flight didn't take off before 5 p.m., you weren't getting out because there were no lights on the runway. So, I sort of took for granted that it was just really hard to move money in those places, and that was just part of the job. And then over the course of my career, moving from a place like Juba to work that I was doing in Syria, based out of Beirut, and then moving on to a long stretch of time in Myanmar, Burma, those challenges became greater and greater frustrations. And I started to feel like we as a sector just weren't doing enough to adapt to some of the technology that was emerging around, different financial service providers, mobile money. And from a very selfish point of view, it wasn't like I was coming at this from an innovation perspective. It was like, I, in my job, cannot pay the people that I want to pay. And I'm having to sit and fight with the finance team to get those payments out. And increasingly, and particularly in the aftermath of the military coup in Burma, I had all these amazing local partner organizations who are just the lifeblood of humanitarian aid. They have better access to communities. They are much more cost efficient a lot of the time. They have the trust of the people they're working with, and they are going to stay in those communities delivering services. So for the longevity of positive outcomes, it's a better place to invest funds. We just couldn't pay them. And what we were asking them to do was to accept very risky ways of being paid. At the time, the Myanmar military was monitoring the financial infrastructure, the central banking infrastructure, private banks as well, for international bank transfers. And then they would turn up at people's offices and accuse them of financing terrorism when they were just delivering humanitarian aid. And so we were asking them to use this method of moving money that was very physically unsafe for them because it was more safe for us from an actuarial perspective. We could account for those funds. We were following the rules, using the official channels. And that tension was what really started to draw my attention to the opportunity to use other ways of moving funds, and particularly blockchain. So I wish I could say that I came to this all on my own and that it was something that I realized immediately was, such a good alternative. But actually, it was these local organizations on the ground that were saying to me, hey, could you guys pay us in a way that's safer for us? And it just hadn't occurred to me that that was the case because all I'd ever heard was how dangerous crypto was. So I had to kind of unpick some of the things that I think are pretty prevalent viewpoints in our sector to get to the point of saying, okay, I'm going to take what these partners are saying seriously. And that was how I ended up getting involved in the space.
What I really appreciate about that story is how many entrepreneurs come because this idea that scarcity creates opportunity and that you're trying to do something, you're being met with friction, and you're probably there saying, how has no one fixed this? And then at some point, a light goes off and says, well, maybe I can. And I do think that is a common thread amongst a lot of entrepreneurs in our space. I also think it highlights one of the big issues that we have, and just to our listeners, if you're listening to this anywhere in the United States, anywhere in Western Europe, you don't have these problems, right? The idea of moving money is not really a challenge. But as we have spoken with people who work all over the world, from East Asia to Latam to Africa, these are fundamental core problems that can be life and death for some folks. And so I think that we take for granted, but it is a lot of the reason people got into crypto in the first place was there was such an unequal financial system. And what if we could have an equalizer that was sort of state agnostic, right? And it sounds like you lived this experience every day.
Very much so. And I think, every member of our team, because the vast majority of people on the Koala Pay team are coming from the humanitarian aid sector. So everyone on our team had some moment where they themselves are being put in a deeply unsafe position to move money. So, one of my colleagues was herself having to stuff $10,000 in her shoe. I had one colleague who was literally flying in, I think it was 40 million in cash, and literally dropping it in pallets from the back of helicopters. So when that's your alternative, I think you are motivated to find a better way of working. What we still bump up against is that the reputation of the sector, sometimes the blockchain space, can mean that people presume that it is unsafe. And we are regularly trying to remind them that the way that we are doing things now is also inherently very risky. And so we had a great, for example, outcome where we had a local partner that was receiving payment across the platform. The conflict dynamics changed, in the midst of this delivery period, and they needed to flee very quickly. And they were able to grab the keys and go, and they were able to continue delivering life-saving aid services without any interruption, despite having to displace. And that's something that seems like a very small thing, but in the context of a place like Sudan, where the banks themselves are not moving money between branches, if those funds had been sat in a local bank branch, which seems safer the way that we think about it when you live in a place like the United States, potentially, if that would have been the case, that money would be gone and they wouldn't have been able to deliver those services. So there is something really revolutionary about giving people that sovereignty and organizations that sovereignty in a context where you maybe can't rely on the banking infrastructure to be there, to function, and to treat you fairly. And I remember when we first started talking to people about what we were doing, and I remember, I'll never forget, I had somebody said, well, why wouldn't you just use PayPal? And I just remember thinking there's such a gap here in information because you've never lived in these places where you don't even understand how hard it is to like the bank, the official banking infrastructure is not connected to the rest of the world. You have to go through intermediary banks in Singapore, Hong Kong, whatever it is. And then all it takes is for you to put the name in slightly backwards from how they expect it to be written. And now your life saving aid funding is delayed by 2 or 3 weeks. We just try to figure out where the money is between banks. And, if that's a business situation, it's bad. If it's the money that's going to provide food aid to communities at risk, it is life or death. So for me, trying to make sure that people, when we talk about Koala Pay, understand the reality of the kinds of places where we work is pretty essential to understanding why something like blockchain is so revolutionary.
It's so funny you mentioned like the PayPal comment because I was literally out last night and one of the people who was part of our party was from London and we were settling up the bill and someone said, "Oh, you can just Venmo me." And he said, "What's Venmo?"
Yeah.
Because I guess in London it's not as common or not, or he had never heard it before. And this is not a person who's not up on technology. And so I just thought it was kind of an interesting opportunity to highlight the fact that not all financial states are equal. I want to talk a little bit about the aid sector as we frame it to then get into Koala Pay. If I'm reading correctly, international aid has been increasing 3x since 20 years ago. With what's going on in the US, it's going to be reformed and probably even rely more on private funding and individual funding, if I'm reading between the lines on some of this data. So I'd love you to just talk about kind of the aid industry, if you will, from a like donation perspective and how that money gets dispersed. But also, I know you've done a lot of work on all the inefficiencies within the current system. And so we can use that, I think, as a bedrock and a framework to then talk about what you're making.
Yeah. I think one of the major misperceptions, and I think this has been exacerbated in recent months, is that we don't know where aid money goes. USAID is one of the most audited government agencies, and it has passed those audits. I would challenge other notable high spending government agencies in the US to pass that same level of scrutiny. The reason we have a lot of the time inefficiencies is because it requires an enormous amount of time and resources to account for the money movement to the degree that we do. So we need to, for example, make sure that we understand where every dollar is going in a place where you don't have electronic or digital records, where you don't have even paper receipts. I have had many a good laugh about having to ask a taxi driver in Bujumbura to write me a paper receipt for a $2 taxi ride because we have to account for that. And then that all has to be reconciled somewhere. And so just the amount of human time that goes into tracking where everything goes and the fact that we do know where things go says a lot about how effective that's been. But you can imagine if those resources, that energy were redirected into more innovative ways to help people, more holistic approaches to supporting communities, how much further we would be in the concept of improving human flourishing if we were doing more of that and less accounting. Like Save the Children should have more child protection experts on staff than they have accountants. But because of this idea that the aid sector is wasteful or we don't know where the money is going, which I think it is a political project that has been perpetuated by people who it's an easy target. The reality is it's a very small amount of GDP. The United States gives a lot of money, but compared to other countries, we give much less in terms of our percentage of GDP. And so it becomes, I would argue, sort of in style to target humanitarian aid funding. And it makes sense. I understand when people are looking around the world and looking around their neighbors and saying, I see a decrease in my quality of life. I see infrastructure crumbling around me. Why are we sending money abroad when we could be helping people here at home? And I wish that when those cuts happened, that was what happened, that the money was redirected back domestically. But we don't see that either. We simultaneously cut international programming when we are also cutting social programming. So I think being realistic about what is actually happening in the aid sector and what we're seeing as far as those cuts go, it's not because we don't know where the money's going. You could log on right now and see exactly every project that USAID has ever given money to and where that's gone. You could see all of what are called third-party monitoring reports that look at the impact they're having. Where we as Koala Pay want to focus is on those administrative costs that are so high because of that high standard to which we hold ourselves. How can we use technology to automate more of those processes so that someone who is incredibly gifted at doing cash programming in conflict affected fragile states that person can focus on more of that and less on trying to figure out why at the end of the month things aren't lining up correctly. And it's because the swings in the FX rate between local currency and US dollar, which the grant was enumerated in, were so severe that you basically needed to have keep track of each transaction time and what the rate was on that day in order to reconcile your books at the end of the month. So if we can have them focused on less of that because it's automated away and more of let's look at the data on how do we lift children under 5 out of poverty, what's really working in this community. To me, that is a net gain. And then we gain a lot of efficiency because we are able to put more of that, our effort and our money to those things that we are seeing have direct impact on community well-being instead of right now where a lot of it goes, which is demonstrating that we know where the money is. So Koala Pay really, we talk a lot about the benefits of transparency and having things tracked on chain, not because we worry that we don't know where the money goes, but because we think people can do more with their time and be more effective with their time when they have tools that help them to automate away that piece of their work.
Do you think, because I want to poke into one thing you said, and I totally get you're focusing on USAID. I think the reputation of disaster happens, right? Fires in Hawaii, earthquake somewhere else, and people then go to like an American Red Cross and make a donation and then hear after the fact, oh, it takes this many weeks if the money actually even gets directed there, and how much of it is going to administrative costs. Is that up to 25, 30%? Which then I think sours people's taste in how can I really make a difference? We're dealing with this a little bit, at least in my timeline, of people donating to immigration causes in Los Angeles right now, as an example. Regardless if you're pro or con the action, people want to help people in some way. And it sounds like there are opportunities to these tools to also make it much more direct, that someone can say, I want to make an impact. I want to send $10. That $10 could be on the ground in 2 minutes, deployed in a need state. Is that what the opportunity also in front of us is, like getting rid of a lot of that waste that happens in traditional nonprofits?
Yeah. What you're knocking on here is a really important difference, which is the difference between unrestricted funding that comes from individual donations and
Mm-hmm.
public funding that comes via government
Mm-hmm.
entities. So when USAID says we have $75 million for X, it comes with a lot of strings and a lot of requirements about reporting, and including, I don't think people probably know this, but if you give a rate to USAID and then they find out a few years later that you gave a lower rate to somebody else for the same kind of work, they'll come after you for that money. They will claw that money back. So they are incredibly careful about where the money's being spent. When you're dealing with public funds or people don't specify exactly how it's going to be used, exactly where it can go, because it's not enough money to have that leverage, then that's where you start to see that they are putting funding towards other costs. So the sort of domestic charitable industry, I think, is very, very different. It's a very different animal from international. So I don't want to conflate those two, but it's also not my area of expertise. I've spent most of my life abroad. So I don't know the American system as well. I have worked with USAID as a donor. I've worked with the British government as a donor, EU as a donor. So I can speak to that. But I think to your point, the idea of a more direct connection is something that we're really passionate about. And one of the things that we find is that even when people say they want to give more directly, when we present them with opportunities to do that, you have this huge trust chasm. Saying, well, I don't know who this organization is. We could say, look at this amazing organization in Malawi that has this youth organization that has single-handedly reduced child marriage by like 100% in their village, right? So an incredibly effective organization of young people. The first thing people say is like, well, how do we know that they're going to be good stewards of that money? So what people say they want to do and what they actually do at the end of the day, often there's a pretty big gap there. And I think that comes down to trust. So one of the things that we are trying to do and that I'm really excited about is that when we have organizations that are being paid via Koala Pay by larger organizations. So let's say one of our partner organizations like Norwegian Refugee Council. They work in 40 crises countries every year. They manage anywhere from $600 to $800 million in aid funding every year, public money. So they're dealing with that really, really high expectation, high requirement funding channel. They're giving grants to small organizations that are working in their communities. We sort of think, well, once they've got that stamp of approval that says, hey, another organization that's dealing with public funds, so they have a very high expectation of quality, they're giving funding to this organization. Wouldn't it be great if we could make it easier then for like Web3 communities to direct funding to those partners directly through either like a matching mechanism or through something kind of dynamic where What we want to move towards is that Web3 companies can come to us and say, hey, or communities come to us and say, hey, we want to do really high impact giving. We don't want to do the work of finding these things ourselves. We don't know how to manage the due diligence on a local organization in Sudan, but we do really care about, let's say it's a company that's tokenizing real world assets, specifically real estate. Like we want to do something related to shelter so we can like help build houses for people, but we just are never going to have an internal team to do that. We would really love to work with them to say, well, we have all these local partners that are doing shelter projects. They're already vetted, they've gone through due diligence, they've received funding from the world's largest NGOs that have the most stringent requirements. And now you can give to them directly through Koala Pay. And so we're starting to do more of that. And that's been really, really fulfilling because it also, from a personal standpoint, means that these smaller organizations often feel like they're working without a lot of public support. It means, like I said, I spent a lot of time in Myanmar. And I think a lot of the people in Myanmar felt, and I don't want to speak for them, but what I've heard from friends of mine is that they felt really abandoned by the international community, that people didn't care what was happening there after the military coup. And it's a place where, the military has been firebombing its own citizens. It's horrific what's been happening there. And people just aren't paying attention. When we had a Web3 donor that said, we want to give, and they directed those funds to local partners in Myanmar, it made it so they felt a little bit less alone in the world and like they had this community of people. I think that's something that Web3 is really great at doing. And I wish we had more of those networks. I think sometimes we get into the habit of wanting to create new projects every time we want to do a new thing instead of building lasting, recurring channels for this giving. And so that's something we really want to encourage is like, yes, you could give a one-off donation. But what if you built giving into your platform so that just happens automatically through every transaction? And then you're building what I always say is in my dream world, international aid feels more like mutual aid. Why is it easier for us emotionally or, just even, in terms of operationally to give to our neighbors GoFundMe down the street than it is to give to somebody in a place like Myanmar that's experiencing extreme hardship? My feeling is it should be equally streamlined to do both.
You're opening up doors that we won't go down too much also about inherent racism and classism and things that exist also within the donation sphere in general. But I actually want to pivot a little bit to having you really just tell us what the Koala Pay product is. What does it do? How has it been helpful? I know you guys ran a pilot in Sudan that I think yielded some amazing results. So I think just for our audience to sort of say, here's actually what I'm building and give us that.
Yeah. So Koala Pay is primarily a sort of full stack solution for the aid sector. So it is built for the aid sector. And as a result, there are some pieces in what I'm about to explain that if you're coming from a Web3 perspective, you might go, that feels redundant. And it is because we are not dealing with Web3 users. We're not dealing with that kind of flow. What we do is we pair stablecoins and smart contracts to initiate payments through payments flows that mirror how the aid sector does it currently, but just moves that whole flow on chain. So everything from the due diligence of local partners, for example, or payees, to the actual contract. Crazy enough, we use smart contracts like contracts, which still seems kind of radical to people somehow. But for example, if you're sending a payment to a local partner, press Koala Pay, that smart contract is going to mirror what your sub-granting agreement looks like. So that could include milestone-based payments. So for example, we've got a project in Nigeria that we're starting up, and for that, they're going to pay 70% on the sort of initiation of the grant, and then 20% on the next milestone, and then 10% when the project is finalized. That's really common. And how that would normally work in the aid sector is that you'd have to submit those documents, the team would have to review them, and then they'd have to send that to finance. So there'd be this delay in the turnaround time of saying, okay, that deliverable has been complete, and now we're going to initiate the next payment sort of tranche. With the smart contract, we can build that all in and automate that process and create a sort of digital documentation of all of those things that were given as part of the OK process for the grant and track who okayed them, who approved them, how was that process followed. So all things that, again, doesn't sound very revolutionary, but to do that manually takes a lot of time and coordination in places where, your power might go out for 8 hours a day. So how do you do that? So across Koala Pay, you can use a platform to pay local partners, to pay vendors, to do what's called local office replenishment. So sometimes just getting money to your own offices in really hard to access places is pretty tough. And also household payments. So household cash transfers we approach in two ways. One is for environments like Ukraine, where you've got people who have, for the most part, phone access and pretty high digital literacy. And then places like Darfur, where you do not. So how do you make sure that you can still do household payments in those kinds of environments? And that's where we're sort of coming in as a payments orchestrator. We don't custody, we don't exchange. We're sort of the switchboard putting together through those smart contracts. All right, there's a liquidity pool here that can provide $100,000 a day. And then there's somebody who wants to get $100,000 a day in from Oslo. We're going to use a smart contract to connect those 2 points. And then the final piece is that we do have some monitoring and evaluation tools that we can deploy that allow us to gather that community feedback, for instance, or partner feedback on what they're doing, how it's going. Has the project been delivered to a standard that we consider is in keeping with protection expectations, conflict sensitivity, all of that? We can get that on the ground information. And where we're very excited to be exploring is that we're actually building that in with a wallet. So the same place that people are responding to feedback requests, they also can be remunerated, which this is my pet sort of ethical issue. I have sat too many times in refugee camps with people who've just experienced a horrific genocide. And I'm asking them these questions about what's going on and how many kids they've got in schools and whatnot. And I had one really formative experience where a woman looked at me at the end of this conversation. She said, I've been in 4 of these interviews in the last month. When is something going to change? I was like, we have to, again, this is we're being forced because we have to know where all that money is going. We have to demonstrate impact. So we have to do that data collection. But the people who are generating this incredible value, this information, and it represents their time and their effort, often in very re-traumatizing situations, they're not being remunerated at all. And so we wanted to create a channel that allows us to remunerate those people who are giving this valuable information about how these projects are going so they can participate in that value system.
And one of the things that I think is sort of underlying in all of this is a lot of the places that you work don't also have stable monetary systems.
Also
And
that.
so, so I know you're based on a stablecoin infrastructure, which does allow for a lot of these folks to also maintain value when their currencies often can be deflationary. But it also seems to solve to some degree the issue that you brought up in the beginning of your friend putting $10,000 in their stock. Can you talk a little bit about the off ramps and is that where you want it to be today, or is that really about what we're building towards the future?
Yeah, stablecoins, I mean, what a revolutionary thing. For our sector, it is genuinely completely changing the game because it is very hard to move dollars around the world. And governments who are very invested in making sure that you cannot use other currencies when they have a rapidly sort of falling value, they will also then make it very hard for people to hold other currencies. And so, for a number of reasons, stablecoins have been just absolutely revolutionary in what we're doing. And it's funny because when we start having conversations with users, like these big international nonprofits, a lot of the time, the first thing they say is, well, how are we going to deal with the volatility? And we're like, no, 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 stable coins. This is going to be less volatility. And when that sinks in for them, you can see that it's the light bulb moment. So really, I think stable coins and what's happening there, it's a sea change for a sector that otherwise really struggles to move money. And all of a sudden we can move money in ways we just never could before. We do see it as a way to protect against currency value, big swings. And it's true that when you are working in a place that's experiencing a crisis or that's man-made or natural, it is very likely that their currency is going to be affected by that. And so it does make operating in that environment more complex. But it also means that we are dealing with less of that back and forth and the value loss that happens moving between currencies. So generally, if you're moving money from here to a third party bank a third country bank, and then you might be doing several different transaction flows that are all sort of taking value out of that chain. So this just allows us to make really direct transactions happen in a single currency. So it's much easier to account for. On your question about off ramps, when we started, I was like, we are not an off ramp provider. We are going to, tap into existing off ramps and then we'll be able to pick the best off ramps depending on where we're working. And we're excited about that. What we discovered is that a lot of products said that they did something. By the time we really got under the hood, we realized they didn't, or they couldn't do it where we were, or they, maybe didn't have the liquidity they were promising. And so, out of necessity, not out of desire, we started to be more involved in that. We think of ourselves more like an off ramp aggregator. We love organizations like Yellow Card who are making it much easier for us to off ramp in various parts of sub-Saharan Africa. We also have other partners that we love in other countries. In some of the places where we work, there just simply are not off ramps. And that is where we come in that payment orchestration space. And we are working with people who have never touched a stablecoin, never had any desire to, that had huge pools of liquidity. And we're the ones that are bringing them in and saying, hey, would you be willing to settle these transactions in stablecoins? Here's why that brings you value. But what we find is like 99% of the time when we explain it to them, they're like, wow, this is a much better way for me to be doing my business. Because usually the reason they have liquidity in a place like Sudan is because they're doing import export. So they need to go to another country and buy their product and bring it in, which means they're trying to get money out of this place that has all these cash problems. That's also not super fun for them. So when we come to them and say, we can pay you in a digital wallet, it's going to go like this, they see this inherent value. And that's allowed us to actually free up a lot more volume in places where there were incredible cash crises because these non-traditional actors were suddenly willing to enter the space in a way they weren't before. And part of that is also because the use of a smart contract means that we can do instant settlement. And that, again, sounds like it's not revolutionary, but in the past, it could take months for somebody who did a payment on behalf of an NGO to actually get paid back. And so if you're in that situation, you don't want to be over your skis for 4 months. So when you suddenly can do instantaneous settlement, you're much more willing to increase those volumes. So we do have these sort of private peer-to-peer networks that we use in some places where there just simply are not sufficient off ramps. We have to do it that way because in the aid sector, we need to know source of funds. We can't risk that the USDT is coming from one of these, like, I don't know, I'm trying to think of a polite word to use here, but one of these facilities along the Thai Myanmar border, which is prolific in terms of the scam stuff that's going on there and incredible human rights abuses. We need to be very, very sure that the money's not coming from there. And so we need to know who these actors are. We need to know their source of liquidity or source of funds. And so we do a KYB, KYC on any of those traders. And so those are tightly kind of firewalled networks that we use. And like I said, not something we did because we really wanted to do it, but in the end, what we found is that it brings a lot of value to what we call off-ramp service providers, OSPs, to them as well as to our core users. And so it's become a bigger part of what we do than we really anticipated. And our off-ramp lead is a guy who formerly was sometimes the person carrying bags of cash across the river into Syria. So I came to him and said, hey, do you want to work on this problem set instead? He was like, thank you. Yes, I would love to do that. And now he regularly gets sort of like WhatsApp messages from these guys who are doing off-ramp service provision in Myanmar, for instance. And they're sending him pictures of the fish they've caught that morning. So he's building these really interesting networks that are very human based. So for us as a business, obviously, long term, we're looking at scalability. So this won't be part of our model forever. But the fact that we're bringing in this new type of user, I think is really meaningful because, again, a lot of the time we are the first product that any of our users have ever seen that is blockchain. And so we're having conversations with them that are enabling them to enter the space in a way that feels safe for them and their business. And we're only able to do that because we understand the business so well.
Yeah, that makes sense. And at least that last piece is something that is not going to be easily replaced by AI in terms of figuring out that off-ramp solution.
For the sake of my time, I wish that it could be because I think all of our team would sleep better if they didn't have so much work going on. But we take a lot of joy out of the first time, you ever facilitate a transaction and people see the difference it's going to make in their lives. You mentioned this pilot that we did in Sudan. This was our first ever test of the platform. Since then, we now, in that same user that you saw the pilot for, like that first contract versus the second contract, they increased the volume across our platform 3,000%. So they were very convinced, that it worked. And the first time we were sat with them, it was their whole team and they sat around a computer clicking the button. And when they could see that the transaction had settled in 2 minutes and cost them 11 cents, a transaction that they had never been able to make before directly from their office to where they wanted that money to go, they sort of like let out a little cheer. It was sort of like, this is a revolutionary moment in our organization. And we all live for those moments in our team because it's like having been on the other side of it and all the frustration over the many years of trying to get cash in and all of a sudden being able to bring this solution to people is incredibly satisfying.
I love that. Yeah. I guess I'm just curious. My final question is, it sounds like you guys have figured out solutions to a lot of the challenges in the aid world that can be helped by new technologies and specifically what you're building and the infrastructure. What do you think is going to take to get Koala Pay to the next level? I mean, is it the Melinda Gates Foundation coming to you? Is it trying to get governments to understand that there are quicker and easier ways and that accountability can happen on chain? What is the inflection moment that will catapult Koala Pay into that next level of opportunity as a core business?
Yeah. It's a good question. I think my sense is that a lot of this had already started. By the time we came into the room, even when we were pre-product, we were having conversations with BHA, the Bureau for Humanitarian Affairs, which is part of the USAID, and they were already saying, we want to start moving in this direction. So we entered into a pretty ripe environment, actually. And I think the timing, we were just very lucky. I've seen UN agencies move faster on things with us than I've ever seen them move in my entire career. We've seen, organizations that I'd worked with previously that were pretty slow moving start to adopt pretty quickly. And I think the conversations are really happening. And there are a couple of key things that I think happened that were really helpful there. I think the way that the humanitarian aid sector responded to Ukraine was fundamentally different than the way that we have had to respond in other places. It was a very different operating environment. And so that really supercharged a lot of conversations about things like moving to multi-purpose cash versus like vouchers. And, so there were a lot of things that were coming out, I think, just because of changes in the sector already. And then what I perceive is that the conversations around cuts to US aid actually probably created space for an organization like ours, who at the time were coming to a very full table and saying, hey, by the way, pay attention to us. All of a sudden the table had been flipped over. And so there were new conversations happening that probably would have taken a lot longer had that not happened. Granted, a lot of those flows have come back, actually. It's just like kind of classic that it's like on the surface, the big news is that it's all been shut down. But of course, under the scenes, like 80% of the funding has come back. It should come back in a different place. So it did allow, I think, for a bit of a reset in terms of how people were thinking about what they were doing, but it was already happening. It wouldn't have just happened because of that alone. Those conversations had already started. I think the aid sector is a very natural place for adoption because of the type of work that we do. Like any international business that's moving money to these really, really difficult places with poor banking infrastructure is going to be ripe for moving to stablecoin-based payments. So the fact that that just happens to be in the aid sector, I think makes a lot of sense. What I think we struggle with is that regardless of this, aid organizations, their primary function is to save lives and improve the outcome of human flourishing. And so they have a pretty full-time job. And when they have to try to change a system over, you're doing systems change in an organization where people are already overstretched. They're already doing very important work. And so you're contending with how fast you can push for an improvement when at the end of the day, they need to get money out the door or they need to get bags of rice out the door, whatever it is. So our timelines are a little bit longer. And I think that we've been incredibly lucky to find backers like Castle Island Ventures and Lattice Fund who understood that and said, we understand that your timelines are going to look a little different, but once you hit that saturation point, it's going to, really take off. And so we're definitely at the moment now where I think everyone on our team feels like we're sort of holding on with our fingertips on this roller coaster. We're getting a lot of everyday people coming in and saying, we want to work with you in this place, this place, this place. So I think we're now looking at just adding like 4 countries in the next quarter. So it's going really fast, which is great, but it sort of ignores that there was a lot of work that happened before that to set the scene and to build the relationships. And again, none of that would have been, I think, feasible had it not been for the fact that our first ever pilot that we did in Sudan, I happened to know the country director because we worked together in Syria. So the aid sector, we do sort of cycle around. We know each other really well. And so it matters a lot that people trust that you have good intentions and that you know what you're doing and you're never going to threaten the core of their work trying to force a technology for the sake of technology. It always has to come back to, I'm trying to make it easier for you to do your job. And I will not get in the way of doing that. I'm only going to be a facilitator. So it's really how you position it, I think. But we've been really lucky so far. And hopefully the next few months are going to be really exciting.
Well, we're excited for you. This has been such a great opportunity to get to know more about what you're working on. I know we had a little bit of conversation in Toronto, but really thank you, Melyn, for sharing all of this with us. Hopefully, this experiment turns into a grand reimagination of the aid business, and I think that it has the potential to do that. So wishing you all the best. We'll keep our eyes peeled, and hopefully we'll connect again soon.
That'd be great.